So what is speciation? Macroevolution. When you hear those terms, a lot of people struggle with those terms. So I want to do a video just giving you some basic steps as to what it is and how it can occur. Macroevolution, speciation. This is evolution of species over long periods of time. I made a previous video on divergence and convergence, so those terminologies will come back into play. Brought to you by Curious Moranland. So, this is what I want to talk about. So first, let's define it. Speciation, the formation of a new species from an original. Well, why? Adaptation to new environments and competition for food, resources. This is everything that Darwin talked about. He said that there's a competition for resources. There's going to be variation, and then natural selection is going to have those variations that are better suited are going to survive. The ones that are not better suited will not. And what our new information talks about is gene expression, genes turning on, genes turning off. So I would pause the video here and take a look at this. There's tons of barriers to separating species. Nature favors the heterozygous. And when I did a video on natural selection patterns, we talked about disruptive and stabilizing and directional. Well, I also mentioned prezygotic barriers and postzygotic. It's pretty much a barrier to prevent sexual reproduction to produce an offspring, and this is a barrier after. So I earlier talked about the male being born sterile. A horse and a donkey make a male. The male is born sterile. So if you see here, geographic, some type of isolation has to happen and separate a group. So I'm just going to do these video slides quickly. So geographic isolation, and that can lead to a new species. Sometimes it's in conjunction with reproductive isolation. And sometimes you have the geographic barrier. It might be anatomical and physiological barriers. Sometimes it's the size difference in the organisms. Social behaviors, mating behaviors. The more complex organisms have more complex behavior. All the apes have social behaviors, but zebras have a social behavior. Lions have a social behavior. So those are things that can cause non-random mating, which leads to the Hardy-Weinberg principle, and switches it for sex selection. Those are all things that can affect the genetic equilibrium. Changing the genetic equilibrium or altering it is what evolution ultimately is. Changing the allele frequency. That's evolution, but the emergence of a new species, well, just to restate the definition again, it's the formation of a new species from an existing species. There's no poof, there they are. It has to be the emergence from a new species. And some simple steps. So what I want to do is put the steps down, and now when you see this, I need to review disruptive selection to see how this happens. So first, this is a recap from an earlier video. So you have a small, medium, large population. Here's your standard bell curve, because starting with stabilizing selection, nature favors the middle. It favors the heterozygous because that preserves both alleles. Imagine this being like little a, big A, little a, and this big A, big A. That sounds like a incomplete dominant pattern, but I don't have time to elaborate on it. So measure it. Some time has passed by. Look at the middle. It went down. Let's overlay it with this. So blue is before and red is after. So let's get rid of the blue after we see the up arrow, down arrow. And these two can become separate populations if they no longer interbreed. So let's look at these little critters here. Let's give them some food. And in here, you're going to see, all right, well, say these ones are going to climb, and that's where they're more drawn to this part of their habitat. But they can interact. They can interact. So now imagine a little bit of water source that separates them. But this one can cross over, this one can cross over. At this point, these populations interbreed. And let's throw in some geographic isolation. Let's expand this. Maybe over thousands of years, this water expanse is thick and bigger. These organisms no longer can pass over. So now we've isolated this group. We've isolated this group. And let's say these critters Here's here. We've done disruptive selection, or we're about to do that. And how do you get to here where they no longer intermingle? You've isolated them geographically, but maybe some of them are not going to reproduce with other ones. Let's bring in some natural selection. Maybe the ones here that climb the trees can avoid the predators. The ones here that survive, they're mixing in the grass where the predators are flying overhead and can't see them. These ones, they're climbing up in the trees to avoid something that can jump up and eat them. Whatever these are, they're selection pressures. These organisms then say, oh, I need to evolve. No. Genes turn on and off, and favorable genes pass on because of the environment. The environment is going to affect them. It's called selection pressure. If you were to remove that barrier, and these population over here, they still reproduce within themselves, and these still reproduce within themselves, there are different species. They are different species. They've diverged. That's divergence. And in this case, you can say adaptive radiation. So one last topic to close out this series. Rates. The rate. There was the older model, which Darwin believed in. It would be gradual, and it's a slow nip and tuck, versus punctuated equilibrium. Gold suggested this, and he recently passed away a couple of years ago. But the fossil record supports this. Population stays stable for long periods, and then there's a shuffling of the deck. So imagine them over here. They're the same species. Two different species here. Now, two different species here. You'll notice there's not much change for this one. What gradualism said was that there's subtle changes, and every time there's a change, there's a major, you'll see it. It doesn't happen like that. When there's a major change, it's an adaptation to changes in their environment. So view gradualism as a straight, long, nip-tuck thing versus punctuated equilibrium. All right, you're at genetic equilibrium here, no change, then change. Stable, 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 or even stasis is another word that they use. Change. And that's what the fossil record shows. So let's show, right, so the old model, organisms change gradually and continuously, but the fossil record does not support that. The fossil record does support long periods where there's no change, and then faster changes or rapid. So if you look over here, stasis and then a rapid change, look at the before and after. It looks like a major radical change when it's not. The visual thing, we have to get away from the morphological explanation. They look alike, therefore they must be alike, or they're drastically different, so it had to take millions of years for it to become drastically different. Sometimes what some of the evidence shows is that it's more like 1,000 years, not at 100 or 100 million, 200 million. And it's all a response to change in the environment. There's just another look at gradualism, and there's punctuated equilibrium. Brought to you by Curious Moranland. Thanks for watching.